How about good afternoon? There we go. Welcome to the 14th Annual Literary Festival. I know you've heard this many times, so if you have any cell phones or gadgets, please turn them off. And we'd like to thank our sponsors, Arch Capital, Howat Family Foundation, Tim Mayo, Thompson Trust, Vermont Humanities Council, Vermont Public Radio, Bob and Alan Works. And please stop in and see our advertisers and shop around Brattleboro today. We would all appreciate it. The festival is run entirely by volunteers, so if you see it in your hearts to give, we'll actually give you something for that. We have some posters, flyers, over by the book sales, and for $2 you get to take one with you. Now, we probably should have said this at the beginning of the festival, and you could have taken them around and had the authors sign them. But we'll remember that for next year, perhaps. There's also no flash photography or recording. Okay, so Maria Tatar is the John L. Loeb Professor of Germanic Languages and Literatures. She chairs the program in Folklore and Mythology at Harvard University, where she teaches courses in German studies, folklore, and children's literature. She has written on or annotated multiple books on fairy tales, folklores, including the Cambridge Companion to Fairy Tales and Enchanted Hunters. And as you know, so many people are into social media these days, even the chair of the Folklore and Mythology Department at Harvard. So I decided to take a look at her Twitter feed. So if you want, you can follow her at Maria M. Tatar, and you'll find some very interesting commentary on her topics and current events. So I'll just name a few. One that I came across, A Darker Side to Happily Ever After. And this is a WBUR interview with Maria where she discusses an obscure archivist of fairy tales by the name of Franz Xaver von Schönwerth. Is that close enough? Whose trove of 500 tales were just recently unearthed in the municipal building in Germany. Here's another one, see if you can guess what's about. How many people have had 3 people in their lives end up dead, dismembered, and disappeared? You know what that's about? This is a retweet of a New York Times article on this time, Robert Durst faces a murder charge in the capitalist celebrity trial. So I'd like to know how that is related to fairy tales. I'm sure it is. Please welcome Maria Tatar.
Thank you. It's great to be here. And I'm going to turn my sound on. Let's see. It's turning green, a good sign. Oh, great. Well, thank you so much for turning out on this beautiful fall day, and I'm just thrilled to be in Brattleboro, this jewel. When I've headed north, my kids went to summer camp up in Maine, so I always headed to New Hampshire or Maine, and now I realize I have made this huge mistake in missing Vermont. So Sandy, thank you for inviting me. It's been a wonderful experience to be here and staying at Kalaka. Am I pronouncing Kalaka? What a thrill! Yes. So the first thing I should do is explain Robert Durst and the Jinx. My son-in-law produced that movie. So that's why you get tweets that aren't quite fairy tale-like, although that story certainly has fairy tale elements in it. Wired for weirdness. Yes, that is what attracted me to fairy tales. There's something so strange about them. They give us pathology, human pathology, in very strong doses. And I started out as a scholar of German studies, and I remember once after I gave a talk, one of my colleagues said, "Why always the pathological, Professor Tatar?" And I'm afraid that, I love the good, the true, and the beautiful, but the dark side is something that I feel is really important to explore, try to understand, and come to terms with. So that is what I'm going to talk about today, that weirdness in fairy tales. And Fairy tales. We often underestimate the value of those stories because of the name we give to the genre. Fairy tales sounds kind of frivolous, whimsical, and silly. And there are other cultural vectors that play into this. The fact that Disney became our portal to fairy tales in the last half of the 20th century, and today still to some extent. So we have these cartoon versions of the tales. We think of them as being for children. They're frivolous, inconsequential. We have that phrase, that's just a fairy tale, kind of dismissing an entire genre of storytelling. So, oddly, of course, as many of you here know, there are actually very few fairies in fairy tales. There are none in Little Red Riding Hood or Jack and the Beanstalk or Beauty and the Beast. And it's really Madame d'Aulnoy in France who coined this term, conte de fées, and helped to introduce the term fairy tales into the English language. So how do we define this strange genre? And I always give my students a mnemonic, the 5 M's. Fairy tales are magical, they're migratory, they're metaphorical, they're metamorphic, and they are mythical. So I'm going to focus on the magical and the metamorphic, but metaphorical, these are always stories that challenge us to look for a deeper meaning. We have the manifest content, and then we're always trying to dig deeper and figure out what the story really means. And migratory, of course, because they're always moving around from, not only from place to place, but today from one medium to another. And as they're moving, they're always shape-shifting, they're metamorphic, and they have a whiff of the archaic to them, that mythical element. Last night we were talking about the juniper tree, where the stepmother decapitates her stepson, and then she and her daughter decide to hide the evidence by cooking the boy up in a stew, which the father eats with great gusto. And of course, all of a sudden, there you are in the realm of Greek myth, the myth of Atreus, and all the terrible things that happen in those stories. So, I tend not to look at, even though I use the term genre several times, I like to think of the cauldron of story, what Tolkien called the cauldron of story, and how each generation keeps adding new elements to make the stew more vibrant, to add a little zest and flavor. Or, of course, Rushdie's wonderful metaphor, the ocean of the stream of stories, where you have this combinatory power, these little strands that are meeting up with each other to form new stories. Or, of course, we can think of the realm of fairy, Tolkien's perilous realm. I like that better than fairy tales. Fairy spelled Faerie. So, as I said, I want to focus on magic and metamorphosis. And magic, I think it's important to remember that in fairy tales, that magic is just taken for granted. That is, Little Red Riding Hood meets the wolf in the forest. He talks, and no one's shocked or startled. There's nothing uncanny about it. You just take it for granted. There's a witch in the woods, and she has a house that is made of candy and bread and all of these marvelous things. And again, that is routine. Or in African American folklore, there's a skull lying on the forest floor. And that skull begins to talk and says, "Talking brought me here." It's a wonderfully self-reflexive tale, a story that I studied last year and found many versions of. But again, no one is shocked or startled, as in fantasy, where there's always a jolt of surprise, like, what is happening? What is happening? You're not rubbing your eyes in disbelief in fairy tales. So in fairy tales, we witness again and again also transformations that break down the divide between life and death, between nature and culture, between the human and the animal, between self and other. Those are some of the binaries I'm going to be taking up and talking about. And metamorphosis, of course, implies magic. So presto, we see the clear link between two of the defining features of fairy tales. One of the great things about these stories is that they are always breaking the rules. They're genre busters. They suspend the laws of nature. They misrepresent reality. They give us fabrications, deceptions, and lies. And if I could have the next image, as you'll see here, the wonderful Zora Neale Hurston, who bought a Pontiac and drove south from Columbia University, where she was studying anthropology with Boas, and said, well, I'm going to go and collect stories. And she did, and there they are in this volume. And what did she refers to them again and again as lies. And lies above suspicion. So these are, this is the way that she characterized those particular stories. And in the next image, we'll see that here's Nabokov, a card-carrying lepidopterist. There he is. And he tells us in his lectures on literature, fiction was born on the day when a boy came home crying wolf, and there was no wolf behind him. In other words, when a boy told a lie about a beast or a monster, about that wolf in the woods. And then in the next image, we have Neil Gaiman in the Graveyard book telling us about the lies that he tells. We who make stories know that we tell lies for a living. They're good lies, he tells us. They tell us true things. That is, you capture a higher truth through them. And then he talks about his responsibility to the reader. There's someone out there who needs that story because they're facing some kind of challenge. Someone who's growing up with a different landscape, who without that story will be a different person. And what does the story offer? Hope, wisdom, kindness, and comfort. And that is why we write, he says. This is, in the next image, you'll see someone from a different cultural climate, Oscar Wilde, telling us about the telling of beautiful, untrue things. And again, this notion of a higher truth. And then finally, Milan Kundera, who actually, this is a passage that describes a painting and the surfaces of a painting. But here, on the surface, an intelligible lie, underneath, the unintelligible truth, the deeper meaning. Remember when I was talking about metaphorical meanings and all of that? And this is why fairy tales are just so deceptively simple. And I think it's Kevin White who tells us they're simply deceptive as well. Then there's a kind of complex thought beneath this simple expression, this simple story. These are stories that get us talking, trying to figure out what that unintelligible truth is. And we can never access. It's always changing. For each generation, that truth, unintelligible or not, is always changing. So beneath these stories lurks something mysterious or abstract. And in our next image, we have Keats telling us about negative capability. And I think I bring him up in every class that I teach. This is when humans are capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, and doubt without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. This is when I talk about my phobia, about my concerns, let's put it that way, about data and big data and all of that. I read about a study recently that shows that college students are 40% less empathetic than they were 40 years ago. Well, how do you measure empathy? I don't know. When I think about, when I was in college, I was not a very empathetic person. I did not do any community service, and I admire the way this, anyway, enough of that. But negative capability, this wonderful phrase about remaining in uncertainty, mysteries, and doubt. And Keats is talking about Shakespeare, actually, and the genius of Shakespeare, that he was able to do that. So fairy tales take us into the arena of negative capability. They defy logic and reason. They move us into a realm of indeterminacy. We can never come to a definite conclusion. And they get us talking because they give us problems that don't yield to easy solutions or don't yield to solutions at all. So where did fairy tales come from? And here's one answer in our next image. This is my colleague, retired emeritus colleague, Ed Wilson, who tells us in The Social Conquest of Earth. And when I invoke this book, I always talk about the way that he describes the discovery of fire, the creation of nests around fires, collaboration, the sense of community that develops. Humans then, for better or for worse, were able to get to the top of the food chain because they did pass on the wisdom from times past, and they encapsulated it in a story, which always made it easier to remember and to pass on. But there are other moments in his book which are so astonishing, and the mind is a simulation of experience that has been lived and recalled, and a simulation of events that would be possible for the future. That is, we use these stories not only to collect the wisdom of the past and give it to future generations, but also to develop counterfactuals. What could be, what might be, what should be. J.K. Rowling talks about that in her 2008 commencement speech at Harvard, how we use stories to imagine the future. And Wilson tells us storytelling is not just important for the human mind, it is the human mind. Our brains are storytelling machines. And I recently came across, somebody referred to the fact that we're such compulsive storytellers that even when we go to sleep, our mind is telling us stories in dreams. We just can't stop, and thank goodness for that. So there's Ed Wilson, and our next image will show us one of those gathering places, not the outdoor fire, but here we're indoors, 17th century depiction of two scenes of storytelling. You can see there's a kind of gender segregation there. The women and children carrying out household chores, telling stories. It's not a very animated group, but I think that's partly the representational practices of the time. But they do have the light and warmth of the fire, the shadows. And again, I'm going to show just a few of these scenes. You'll see that everyone's gathered in this hermetic space, their own little world, with these chiaroscuro effects, the light, the hope that Neil Gaiman told us about, the beauty, but then also the darkness, the shadows, the scary things. So there they are, and I think, I don't know whether this is pushing it too far, but I love the fact that there's a couple in the center, and there's the woman with the spindle. And somehow, I think that pair in some ways incarnates the spirit of storytelling that is hovering over this scene. And let's take a look at our next image, which gives us the frontispiece to Perrault's Contes de ma mère l'Oie, Tales of Mother Goose. A little misleading because Mother Goose suggests all those nursery rhymes. These are fairy tales, 7 fairy tales that are collected and published in 1697. Perrault sort of disavows authorship. He attributes them to his 12-year-old nephew, who couldn't possibly have written these. I mean, the literary register is not that of a child. But there's this another scene of storytelling, and you see now how stories from the childhood of culture have migrated into the culture of childhood. It's a granny figure who is telling the stories to children, and notice also that she's got the spindle there. And in the next image, we will see the frontispiece to the first British translation of the Grimm's fairy tales. This is George Cruikshank, who gives us a scene of storytelling. Again, that hearth, the blazing fire, the hermetic space, the light and shadows, and the children looking eagerly at this figure who is telling the tales. And our next image shows us the second frontispiece to that British translation of the Grimm stories. And you notice here a striking difference. Suddenly there's a book. It is no longer improvisation, but there's an actual script. And this is, of course, the time at which the Grimms really started this project of collecting the stories before they disappeared. It was partly a patriotic project. It was also for them a scholarly project, and they were hugely surprised when they discovered that they had a bestseller on their hands. And over the years, they made the book more child-friendly by taking out all of the references to things like pregnancy. Rapunzel, remember Rapunzel up in the tower? In the first version, she asks her godmother, as she's called, why are my clothes getting so tight? And that kind of thing quickly disappeared from the editions as they became, as they were produced more for audiences of parents, actually, who were reading the stories to children at night. So a next image will show us what happens as these stories migrated into the nursery. And here, again, we have the book, but notice that raised finger. And I talked about, removing, excising sexual allusions or scatological moments from these tales. But what was added, and what Perrault added already at the end of the 17th century, was a moral. Every story ended with a line explaining that you should beware of strangers for Little Red Riding Hood, and so on and so forth. So suddenly, you see maybe this is not such fun, although it's still scary stuff, of course. Children are sensation seekers, so they love scary stuff, but these kids look pretty terrified, and there she is pointing the moral. And I don't know many fairy tales that end with, and the ogre ate him up. Usually the great thing about fairy tales is the child is a survivor and manages to get out and escape and defeat the ogre. But here suddenly the stories get a disciplinary edge. Instead of those great what ifs, those counterfactuals, we have a kind of the pointing finger saying, or else. And in our next image, we see, you could see how the stories have sort of, here again, the crone with the raised finger pointing a moral. And the astonishing thing, and you probably can't see this too well, is that nobody is looking at her. She is no longer the center of attention, and they all look supremely bored and would rather be somewhere else. And then our last image in this series here is, this is called The Story of Golden Locks by Seymour Joseph Guy. We're at the end of the 19th century. And I love this because the hand is, you could see this as a kind of benediction in a way. The book is open to the page on which the bears enter the house, and Goldilocks has to go running out. And the two children in bed are quite terrified at this moment. But she is possibly trying to frighten them into or good behavior, or maybe just frighten them. And our last image here is, this is a shot of the Kindle that I got some years ago, and it came with the words "Once Upon a Time," and a little bit of black and white fairy dust. And the fact that it's called Kindle, and the second version was called Kindle Fire, it sort of shows how new media are always referring back to old media and invoking them. I love the term that media gurus use, the delivery systems, the new delivery systems for stories. And I was just telling Sandy last night, I had my first, Kindles maybe are not that bad, when I saw two children, brother and sister, 5 and 6 years old, curled up with a Kindle and looking quite happy. And so we have these new delivery systems, and the story is still there. The power of the story is not lost. So I want to turn now to the big question of the function of fairy tales. Why do they stick? Why do we tell them? why do we have this kind of cultural repetition compulsion? And I should add that I started studying fairy tales back when Bruno Bettelheim was championing the uses of enchantment and telling parents that children really needed the dark side in fairy tales. That parents shouldn't worry about the violence in fairy tales. Children needed it. It had therapeutic benefits. Just a few weeks ago, I was reading Turing's biography, The Enigma. And do any of you know that story about how he died with the apple by his bed? He was obsessed with Disney's Snow White and the poisoned apple. And in his kitchen was a jar of cyanide. So, you know, it really, I'm such a cheerleader and champion of fairy tales, but that, reading about that suddenly gave me pause about the therapeutic benefits. I then immediately thought of counter arguments, and I won't rehearse them because I'm sure you can think of them as well. But that was my start, and I have, of course, many disagreements with Bettelheim, who is pretty much an orthodox Freudian, but who has wonderful, extraordinary things to say about fairy tales. But to me, what is supremely important is that they do cultural work for us. And they have a kind of what Paul Ricoeur, the French philosopher Paul Ricoeur, refers to as ontological vehemence. That is, they're just, you know, words in the air, breath in the air, or they're just words that we read, and yet they take on the character of reality. They have this power. They get us thinking more, and moving in the optative mode. This past year, I worked on a volume of African American folk tales and discovered something called the dilemma tale. And these dilemma tales always end not with happily ever after or with any kind of resolution, but just with a puzzle, an enigma, and a mystery. So to give you an example, a boy is driven out of his home by his abusive father, who's a rat catcher. And he is adopted by a wealthy man, dressed well, he lives this good life. And one day he arrives at a crossroads, and his adoptive father says to him, "Here's a sword, and you're going to either have to kill your biological father, who happens to be here, or me." And the story ends, what should he do? What should he do at this point? So you can see how the point of a story like that is to generate talk. You know, a debate about nature versus nurture. And this is what, remember at the beginning I was talking about these cultural contradictions, these enigmas that are elaborated in the stories, these counterfactuals that stimulate curiosity. They get us talking, they build community through conversation, and I think make us care about our values. So the spirit of storytelling, I think, in many ways takes up what the anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss referred to as these cultural contradictions. So these miniature models of conflict are basically generative. They get us talking in the same way that headlines do their cultural work today. And the logic in them is always changing. We're constantly making it new, to use Ezra Pound's slogan. And that's exactly why I think a story like Little Red Riding Hood can stay alive. And just in that context, I think it's important to note that the most skillful raconteurs, the best storytellers, are always the iconoclasts, because the only way that you can really preserve the story and keep it alive is by undoing its terms and by trying to blow it up. That is, you know, if you told the same story over and over again, it actually would fade away. But by making it new, by reversing its terms, by doing odd things to it, I think we really keep it alive. So I want to look at some of those cultural contradictions and just do, I think I have about 20 more minutes, is that right? Yeah, great, okay. So we'll just run through Little Red Riding Hood, Beauty and the Beast, and I'll close with Sleeping Beauty. And Little Red Riding Hood, our first story, takes up the question of innocence and seduction. Beauty and the Beast, I think, engages with the question of compassion and alterity. And then our final story, Sleeping Beauty, tells us something about the relationship between beauty, art, and death. So let's take a look at our first story, and we have here Charles Perrault. We could go back to the fireside, and there we would find that there's a story about Little Red Riding Hood in which she performs a striptease for the wolf. I should back it up because first she drinks. She gets to Granny's house, and there's a bottle of wine and a plate of flesh. And it's Granny's blood, or a plate of meat. She thinks it's a plate of meat, but it's Granny's flesh. So she has that. She goes to the bed and perform. She doesn't say what big eyes you have, what big ears you have. Instead, there's this litany of each item of clothing as she takes it off. And she doesn't need a hunter to escape. Instead, what she does is she tells the wolf that she gets in bed, she realizes this couldn't possibly be Granny. So she tells him that she has to relieve herself. And finally, he lets her go outside, and he puts a rope around her ankle. She then manages to cut herself loose and runs home. So she rescues herself. But Charles Perrault gives us this first literary version of Little Red Riding Hood. And did any of you grow up with his version, which ends, the girl is swallowed by the wolf, end of story? I mean, we do get the moral, but there is no hunter there to rescue the wolf. And then we learn that in the lesson that the most dangerous wolves are the ones who don't have fur at all, those smooth-talking wolves. So suddenly it's a cautionary tale about stranger danger. So what happens then with the brothers Grimm? And if we can take a look at the next image, we'll see that the brothers Grimm, of course, are determined to make their entire volume a behavioral manner, ein Erziehungsbuch, as they refer to it, for children. So they start the story with all kinds of imperatives and directives from the mother. That is, better start off now, get up early, go straight on the path, don't stray, and then don't forget to say good morning as soon as you walk in, and don't go poking around in all the corners. In other words, don't be curious. You should not be a curious. You should just have your mission and go straight on it. And then in our next image, we see that they also add a lesson. And this is, the child has actually internalized the lesson. So she says, never again will you stray from the path and go into the woods when your mother has forbidden it. So the story becomes all about obeying mother. So our next image shows us the way in which we continue to tell that lesson. I mean, in some ways we tell the same old story to children. And so here is this rather grown-up Gothic Red Riding Hood. Never again will you stray from the path and go into the woods when your mother has forbidden it. Almost straight from the Brothers Grimm. And the next image, I would say, it's surprising that Trina Schott-Hyman didn't play more with the story, but she's quite reverent about it. And Little Riding Hood, I'll never wander off again. As long as I live, I should have kept my promise to mother. So she sticks with that story. And we have a tendency to do that with the versions for children. In the next image, you'll see Neil Gaiman. Not that I'm obsessed with him, but he's so brilliant on many of these questions. And in The Ocean at the End of the Lane, adults follow paths, children explore. And the great thing about children, of course, is that they're so curious. They're philosophers, they're scientists, they're explorers and adventurers. So adults tend to stay on the path. But you remember, what do children do when faced with a path? They go off the path, they explore, the in-between spaces, they go beneath the rhododendra. I knew a dozen different ways of getting out of our property and into the lane, ways that would not involve walking down our drive, taking the straight and narrow. So I just wanted to mention in this, just to close out, a couple more things about Little Red Riding Hood. But in our next image, we see Michel Foucault, who tells us about how there once was a time, and maybe around the fireside, where children heard that story about Little Red Riding Hood, complete with striptease, the scatological moments and all of that, where children grew up very quickly, and the way they learned was through these stories. But Foucault tells us that there was a culture of silence that descended, sort of in the 19th and 20th, in our own, maybe not in our own century, where we've got the internet and children have access to a lot more, but where you wanted this sort of disciplinary edge to the stories. You didn't want them to be fun and games and riotous entertainments. At the same time, what Foucault tells us is that adults begin talking endlessly about sex. They just can't stop themselves. So in our next image, we see the fate of Little Red Riding Hood in an adult culture. And of course, we think that we've discarded these stories, but they flourish in all kinds of media. Here's a French illustration to the story of Red Riding Hood. Not at all child-friendly, as you can see. I mean, this is not something that you would certainly the book itself with that illustration is not something you would use for bedtime reading. And in the next image, we see Tex Avery's Red Hot Riding Hood. And there, it's in this medium that is for children, but, she's a stripper in a nightclub, and there is this lascivious wolf. And our next image will show us Little Red Riding Crop. And on the right, you see an ad for aftershave. And this shows, an elated girl in red motoring off eagerly with a wolf. And then, of course, there are many Hollywood films that recycle the fairy tale. So we get, and our next image will show us Freeway. Has anyone else seen this film? Oh, you I'm sure Reese Witherspoon wishes that it would just go away. But there's From the Dust Jacket. I don't know whether you can read that, but a twisted take on Little Red Riding Hood. Reese Witherspoon plays a teenage juvenile delinquent on the run from a social worker, trying to get to Granny's house, while she's being hounded by the charming but sadistic serial killer pedophile. And of course, he's named Bob Wolverton. He's a shrink as well, I think, isn't he? Yeah, of course he has to be the shrink. And she actually has a basket, and her boyfriend is named Woodchopper. And, so it's very clearly a reimagining of that story. And then we have Hard Candy, and here the filmmaker actually about halfway through realized that he was making a Little Red Riding Hood story. So he put Ellen Page in a red hoodie. And who is she dealing with but an internet sexual predator? And here the roles are completely reversed. I mean, she is not so innocent. And he gets into the wolf trap quite, well, not so innocently either. But she manages to turn the tables on the predator. And another version, Hannah, is a wonderful film in which he puts this killer girl on steroids, those killer girls in Hard Candy and in Freeway on steroids. He reinvents Little Red Riding Hood as a genetically modified teenage assassin. She grows up in the woods, and what is she reading at night but the Grimm's fairy tales? And notice, she doesn't have a red hood. She's got a fur hat. She is the wolf. She is the predator at this point. And she goes from the woods in Norway to Berlin. She takes a trip to the house of Wilhelm Grimm. And, again, these very clear markers there that this is a Little Red Riding Hood story. Oh, by the way, at Wilhelm Grimm's house is she meets her grandmother there. And then we have all kinds of strange, again, look at what adult culture does to this story. And our next image shows us various movie stars. dressing up as provocative innocents. So they're seductive, sultry, and provocative. And you can see how, the story plays with this binary, this innocence and seduction, and we're constantly sliding back and forth. And of course, today we can we pivoted toward the view that we are the predators. The beast is innocent, especially now that we're at the top of the food chain and we can outwit all those predators out in the forest. So let me turn quickly to our second story, Beauty and the Beast. And here we have a story that takes up a range of binaries, from the nature-culture divide to the split between self and other. And it takes up, really the question of how do we respond to monstrosity? Someone who is completely different. Do we respond with rage, with hostility, with fear, compassion, charity, admiration, or identification? And it's a story that I think has become particularly relevant to our own concerns today. Jacques Derrida has this wonderful term, hospitality, which tells us something about our ambivalence. Hospitality sometimes has this element of hostility embedded in it. Here we have the story of Beauty and the Beast, and I wanted to take it back to some of the sources. Remember, I said that these stories have the mythical, the wind of the mythical sort of blowing through them. And if you think back to these stories about mortals and gods, there's Leda and the Swan, Europa and the bull, Zeus as bull, you can see him here. Persephone, figures are constantly being abducted by monsters, by beasts who are gods. So it's not all that terrible, although, of course it's terrible. Here's Zeus, of course, represented as this rather benign creature. It doesn't really, and she, of course, Europa looks like a Madonna. She's been elevated by this encounter. But what a complicated story. And when you read Hawthorne, Hawthorne's version of this story, Europa is a little girl. She has a basket from her mother. And, oh, what a wonderful little, opportunity this is to go riding off on the back of a bull. We have that. I think the story also in some ways captures a lot of the anxieties about arranged marriages. Because, a suitor in an arranged marriage, of course, seemed like a beast. These wealthy older men in particular seemed were frightening. And maybe the story in some ways just captures anxieties about marriage in general. A horror of marriage because men are like beasts, sex is beastly, and it turns us into animals in a way. So remember the term old wives' tales. This may have been a way of passing on wisdom from older women to younger women. So fairy tales have this interesting way of giving us an amalgamation of myth, history, and psychology. And it's almost impossible to sort all of that out. So in ancient times, we have that particular story. And let's go to our next slide. I'll just touch very quickly on the earlier versions. There's an Italian, our first literary version is one in which we have a pig king, and he actually pounces on his first two wives and kills them. He has sharp hooves, and it's only the third of the three sisters who survives the encounter and lives happily ever after. But you can see we have this sort of devolution of the beast from a divinity to a lowly creature. Think of the Grimm's, many of you probably know the Grimm's Frog Prince, the Frog King as it's sometimes referred to. And there, how is the frog is turned into the prince when, through an act of passion rather than compassion, the girl throws the frog against the wall and he turns into a prince. So I wanted just to touch quickly on some of the ways in which we reimagine Beauty and the Beast. And oddly, Disney's Beauty and the Beast seems to be in the vanguard of the rebellion against the tale as it was once told, turning Beast into a charismatic figure, completely charming. And you can see him standing before her, let's see, there after the transformation. And if you watch the film, you remember you get to see Beauty's eyes, and she actually looks disappointed when he's been turned into this sort of Fabio look-alike. And so post-Disney, we get something like Shrek, where the monster, the transformation takes place from the human to the beastly, and Fiona embraces her inner monster, and they actually look much happier together than the other couple. So our next image will show us just a few other rescriptings: Beastly, the wonderful Bête of Cocteau, and Wolf with Jack Nicholson and Michelle Pfeiffer. Can I give away the ending? Just cover your ears if it's a problem. They both turn into werewolves and live happily ever after. It's like John Sheetska's The Frog Prince Continued, where the story begins with marital discord. After the happily ever after, it turns out they're not so happy. And what happens? The two go hopping off into the pond, and they both become frogs and live happily ever after. And there, another reimagining, our next image gives us, fashion shoots love fairy tales. You're always getting these images of Beauty and the Beast, or Little Red Riding Hood, or Cinderella. So let me just, I wonder, should I stop now, or should we go quickly to Sleeping Beauty? And, oh, all right, well, let's do a quick take on Sleeping Beauty, or Briar Rose, as it's also known. And we'll see an image of her in the, there she is, Edward Burne-Jones's Briar Rose. He did a series of 6 paintings. And I think, I can't remember which one. This may be the final one in the series, but for some reason, I can't remember exactly. But Sleeping Beauty, what a title. I mean, could this be a story? It's complete stasis, Sleeping Beauty. There's no temporality in it at all. And it's a story, so you're using words to tell it, and yet there's something so supremely visual about that tale. And remember when I referred to ontological vehemence, I think this story gives us that, because we all, as we read about this woman in the castle surrounded by briars, we begin to see her in our mind's eyes. Illustrators, of course, help us to do that job, but I think we also have our own versions of Sleeping Beauty in our heads. So time is arrested. And here I want to go back again to an early Italian version. Sleeping Beauty in the castle. A king, a hunter who is a king, finds her and harvests the fruits of love, but he doesn't wake her up. So it's a story about necrophilia, really, and they are reunited eventually, but only after some efforts at cannibalism, because the he's married, and so the first wife is not happy about these 2 children. Talia, Sleeping Beauty is called Talia, she has 2 children, and the king's first wife decides to have them for supper. There is a happy ending, not for the first wife, who ends up in a vat and is devoured by snakes and all kinds of terrible creatures, scorpions and all of that. So it's quite a story. And you can see that Perrault has really cleaned it up. There's no kiss in Perrault even. The prince just happens to arrive on time. He's there, and she wakes up, and it's almost as if she says, what took you so long? I think she says, I've been waiting such a long time for you. And so we have Perrault's story, and Perrault, I think, really strengthens the link between sleep and death. As there's the Greeks, of course, thought of sleep and death as brothers. And there's something about that story, you know, death, she's so beautiful. She has immortality. It's a story of, remember Selene who falls in love, the goddess Selene, the moon goddess who falls in love with Endymion, and he's put to sleep by Zeus and becomes a Peter Pan. He's an eternal youth. He just remains as beautiful as he was when he was put to sleep. So Briar Rose, and it's almost tragic when she wakes up because now she's going to be subject to age, to mortality. So, you know, again, you can see how deeply implicated this story is in the question of art, immortality, death. And then we have the Grimm's Little Briar Rose, who's also sort of frozen in time. And she's the one who inspired then this series of illustrations, completed in 1890 and put in somebody's living. Can you imagine having a living room with 6 of these portraits? Quite something. Yes, it is the last canvas in the series now, I see. Today's Sleeping Beauty can be found in many different variations, from Aurora in Disney's animated cartoon, and then in our next image to the eponymous character in Anne Rice's Sleeping Beauty trilogy. And the suppressed theme of necrophilia comes back with a vengeance in works like this. So our next image shows us kind of this great moment in Mad Men where they're talking about shoes, selling shoes, and one of the ad men says, I always thought that Sleeping Beauty and Snow White are more about necrophilia than shoes. And clearly he's onto something there. And our next image gives us, you know, something as unlikely. I mean, who would think that Quentin Tarantino would be embedding a Sleeping Beauty in his film Django Unchained? But you're nodding, and the heroine is called Brunhilde, a reference to Brunhilde, who is the Sleeping Beauty, put to sleep by Wotan, surrounded by a ring of fire. And where is she? Where does she have to be rescued from? She's in a heat box. She's sort of buried underground. And again, this connection with death. So there she is. And I'm sure if I looked at it again, I would find other references. So that this tale is resurrected and constantly refashioned, I think tells us that the emergence of a female trickster in some of those Little Red Riding Hood tales doesn't necessarily signal a seismic shift in the possibilities of female agency. That is, Sleeping Beauty, with her magnetic beauty, invites a kind of risk-free voyeurism, and she remains a hauntingly seductive figure in our cultural imaginary, reminding us of the nexus of femininity, beauty, and death. So one of the things we should do is talk to her, which is a big theme in one of my courses. It's that great film by Pedro Almodovar, where you have 2 catatonic women, talk, so many Sleeping Beauty references in that. We should talk to her, to Sleeping Beauty, but also to each other about the uses of enchantment. So I'm going to close with the next image, Einstein, who, pre-Miley Cyrus, and I think he had it right when he told parents, if you want intelligent children, read them fairy tales. And if you want more intelligent children, read them more fairy tales. And I think he got it. He understood exactly how fairy tales take us down the rabbit hole, through the looking glass, and how they get us to think more. Thanks very much. And do you want me to take questions, or do people have to go to the next event? Yeah.
I think we have time.
Oh, great. Okay. Yes.
We have a couple of microphones that we will run around.
Okay.
Early Disney was early Disney. I just Whether it's on Broadway or in film, I cannot stand the Disneyfication of literature. And so have we lost the real essence of these tales? I recall one time trying to put a script together with people based on, the 1001 Nights. So we read several of the tales, and the kid said, "Oh, this isn't Aladdin." And I said, "What do you mean?" "Well,
yeah.
it's, not this, he wasn't in the Disney one." I said, "Oh." So have we lost, or is there any hope of reclaiming with the madness of the popular culture around what Disney has done to these tales?
Oh, yeah. Well, to me, the upside to Disney is that Disney kept the stories alive. And I think that we would have lost some. I mean, imagine that he's making a film about a German fairy tale in 1937. Or I guess when did he start making Snow White? That he's fascinated with German folklore. What were the chances of that happening? And he makes an art film, and he's really trying to make something beautiful. So, I know exactly what you're talking about. Certainly there's a huge downside in the commodification of fairy tales, and the way in which many students, and not so much anymore, but students used to come to my class and think that Disney had made these stories up. And that, it was the one true, that was sort of the original, and everything else developed. But, the great thing is once you learn, he just made another version of it. It's just so intoxicating almost to go back, not always, because you read Anderson, and you discover, the Little Mermaid doesn't make it, and she's got to do 300 years of community service to get a soul, It's pretty dreadful. So, but there's something great about then debating, the different versions, again, getting us in, and there's this wonderful book by Sherry Turkle now about reclaiming conversation in an age of social media, digital media. And I think that the friction that's created between the Disney version and another version is something very powerful. So I guess, I have one of my students recently posted something about his love-hate relationship with Disney. And I immediately thought back to one of the classes that he had attended. We had talked about the love-hate relationship to Disney that so many of us have. Thank you.
Oh, and I was going to say, my sense from the recent NPR thing about Disney is that in a way Disney had a love-hate relationship with the people who controlled the depth or intensity of the movies he could make.
Right.
And what Disney is now, which is an industry, is really different from Disney's early vision.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know whether all of you have seen this PBS documentary on Disney, quite extraordinary. And his relationship with the animators, they were badly paid, even the creative team, but then the women who were consigned to basically doing coloring were paid even worse. So he did have a sort of contempt. It was always, why are you so grumpy when they went on strike? The night before the strike, he scolded them for being grumpy. Remember Grumpy the dwarf? And dissatisfied. And, they should just go ahead and do their work and be cheerful about it. So he had no understanding at all. But then look at what the animators did in something like Frozen, where, Disney is a corporation, it's big, it can't change much, it's culturally conservative, and yet, this is an enterprise with people in it. And Frozen, well, the minute Frozen came out, one of the early reviews all talked about how it was an anthem to coming out, that there was a subtext to that story. It may have been about sisters, but you could read it in other ways. So it's multi-layered, it's nuanced, and it's another version of the story, and it gets us critiquing it or embracing it or saying, no, I want to tell a different version. I've got another story that I want to tell. Yes, Sandy.
over here and then back over there.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry. I teach.
Oh, there you are.
I teach here locally in town, and I use kamishibai a lot as part of my teaching, Japanese storytelling technique. And most of the kamishibai that are here in the U.S. are Japanese folk tales. And so often when I'm introducing these stories, I'll say to kids, I'll just ask, like even really young kids, like, who knows? And I'll start listing a bunch of fairy tales, and all the little hands go up. And then I say, so every child in Japan knows about Peach Boy. And then they instantly settle down, and they're like, they know where they are. They're about to enter this world where everyone knows the stories. And I just find that really fun and really powerful for kids. And really for me, I think that's why I keep doing it, because I think it's so powerful.
Because everyone responds. They've got the story in their heads. And Momotaro, the Peach Boy, is an extraordinary tale, one that I'm sure Maurice Sendak had in mind when he wrote Where the Wild Things Are. That journey that is taken. So it's interesting how, we have this European canon, but these folktales from all over the world seep into our culture, and now more so than ever, I think. They're more migratory than they have been in times past. So that's great to hear, though. Yes, Sandy?
Over the past 4 years, 3 or 4 years, I guess, there's been an incredible increase in television shows that are fairy tale based, like Grimm and
Once Upon a Time.
Once Upon a Time, and what do you attribute the sudden rise in popularity of those kind of shows, or what in Hollywood is going on that's making them produce them?
Yeah,
Is there
that's
something
yeah.
that's happening in our society that's causing people to go back and look at that?
Yeah, I think on the one hand, they've never really gone, I talked about Disney as sort of bringing or keeping the stories alive, but if you look at classic Hollywood cinema, there's so many Cinderella stories. They still circulated in the culture. But, but I think you're onto something, because there is, in times of crisis, and, you could argue we're always living in times of crisis. We certainly are. But we're going through this tremendous transition, right? Think of the Industrial Revolution and how many decades it took. We've got this digital revolution, which is, if you think of the loss of jobs, journalism is sort of bookstores. What has happened to all of these professions that just disappeared, and how the younger, at Harvard, our students are encouraged to become entrepreneurs. All of a sudden, I was wondering, why does that term bother me so much? This was about 5 years ago, entrepreneurs, innovation, and all of that. And suddenly, a few weeks ago, I realized, well, of course, they're not getting jobs anymore. They're facing unemployment. Harvard students are facing unemployment, and, they have to become entrepreneurs. So, in times of crisis, when you have to get smart really fast, and, so many of these stories take place in times of famine, where you do have to be really quick-witted. There's something about the comfort of the stories, but also about the wisdom of the stories, which I think we're unconsciously recognizing, and so that may be part of the explanation, but it's a big question, and I can only give you one slice of it. I'm sure all of you have some different take or angle on that. Thanks.
A lot of Rudolf Steiner education, and especially for the little children, stories are told instead of read to. And the belief is that a tell story is a heart-to-heart communication, and a written story or a read story is an intellectual-to-heart communication. And so with the little children, it's always told.
Yeah, great question. I'm thinking about how my kids always wanted me to make up a story, and I was always so bad at it. That I often relied on the story and then sort of retold the stories that I had seen in print. So that in-between space, I think, at a certain point I said, that's okay. You know, I'm making up my own story. And then the importance of reading, or telling rather, telling versus reading. But above all, I think with both telling and reading, you're creating a contact zone with the child. And so even if you just read from a script, you're obviously going to discuss the story. And you certainly, you know, what if you read the French version of Little Red Riding Hood? You're going to start improvising and talking very quickly if it's a young child. Or me reading The Juniper Tree to my kids and very quickly realizing that, you know, I couldn't possibly read them this story. So making things up. Or, you know, my daughter, of course, somehow, I think she was a couple of years older and she knew I was changing it. So she was demanding that I read it. And that's when you can have the conversation and say, why is this crazy thing happening in the story? But that's a great point about, you know, the trade-off between those two, and the reading being more of an intellectual exercise.
I think I've heard you comment on this before, but I thought I'd ask it. Is that what's your take on Anne Sexton's Transformations? That collection of poetry on Grimm's fairy tales.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of that book. I'm not a fan of the way she got onto the Grimm's fairy tales, because her daughter came home from school and did this little ritual, cooking Campbell's soup, making herself a bowl of soup. And she sat down, started reading from a book which was Grimm's fairy tales. And Anne Sexton grabbed it out of her hands. I mean, this is the daughter's version of it, and then went into her study and started typing madly. And it's an extraordinary volume because it's quite literal about recapping the Grimm's fairy tales, but then using the story as a point of departure for a meditation on what is going on in her head. And it becomes a kind of, she was in therapy at the time, so she is exploring, she's doing a kind of archaeology of fairy tales. And if you remember how that begins, she positions herself as the witch with her mouth open, you know, hungry, but also a speaker, creating her own versions of that story, a witch who's now going to tell a tale. So I think it's just so powerful, and it really challenges you to rethink the terms of the stories. Yes.
I keep going back to the image that you showed early on about that finger, the
Pointing,
the crone,
yeah,
the crone
yeah,
with the finger.
right.
And what I'm hearing, or what I'm taking away from this discussion, is that each of the societies that these stories have kind of been filtered through has used them for different purposes, and I'm wondering if that finger of kind of morality, if that was the reaction of kind of a Christian church kind of, and like something, maybe the Christian versus pagan versions of the story, the way the stories evolved and changed, and that when basically the sex and the scatological gets pushed off to the side, and the only thing that remains is the violence.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, like, do you see them as a metamorphic thing in and of themselves as they've changed and gone through time, through different cultures?
It's fascinating because the Grimms themselves were trying to create this cultural heritage, as I said, and a scholarly book, but they were also trying to record the pagan past. Then you read through the collection and you realize there's a Christian overlay to many of the stories. Hansel and Gretel in the woods, for example, are saying their prayers in the woods, and we hear those prayers. Sometimes in some of the stories, not the ones we read today, but there's St. Peter, and so you have a Christian cast of characters at times. So actually, what you said sort of strengthens my comment. I've always been a little bit skeptical of the idea that the girl's hand is raised as a benediction. But I think there's something to that. That is the lesson, the preaching, the teaching, the biblical, the truth, the spiritual truth of the stories. So maybe it's not just the pointing finger or else, but also here's wisdom, here's a higher truth, here's spiritual sustenance for you.
What's the spindle?
I think the spindle has something to do with, we refer to text, to spinning a tale, a yarn. So often, Penelope at her loom unraveling every night. There's something about the domestic arts that is deeply connected with the old wives' tale. I mean, we have the high mythical sacred stories, and then popular culture, which is often associated with women and the domestic arts. And but even though, of course, we know that many of the Grimm's sources, the Grimm's informants, but also the informants for many of the 19th century collections were men, were male storytellers. But that whole, Karen Rowe has a wonderful article about that particular question, the domestic arts, textiles, weaving, spinning, and fairy tales. Yes.
Did you read Michael Cunningham's article about a story about Rumpelstiltskin in the New Yorker called "The Little Man"?
Oh, tell us about it, because I've seen it, but I haven't yet read it.
So I just happened to read it, and I started. You start to read it, and you realize this is Rumpelstiltskin, but this is Rumpelstiltskin's point of view of the story of Rumpelstiltskin, and I totally recommend it. And I actually gave it to my husband, my kids, like everyone I told loved the story. But it also tells the power. Like we knew the story, so it was. But it was a totally new story, but it was of course familiar, and it was like, oh wow, as an adult I can read, another version of it. But it was wonderful. But it said he has reworked many fairy tales, and he has a book coming out in November of that entire. That's what it is.
Oh, is that right?
Yep.
Oh,
and
wonderful.
Michael Cunningham. I mean, it was kind of surprising, but I really recommend it.
Yeah.
About a month ago.
The way in which the new scriptings of it forces to just rethink everything about the story. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. What's the name of the?
I think it was called The Little Man. I'm not positive.
It is The Little Man. Yeah.
And you wouldn't think reading the title, oh, I want to read this. There's nothing about it. Then you just like a few paragraphs in, you're like, oh my God, this is Rumpelstiltskin.
Yeah, and I think it's online.
Yeah, I'm sure it is. So I really recommend it.
Yeah.
Cunningham.
Michael Cunningham, who wrote The Hours.
Yeah, thanks.
Well, that's a lot like Cheska and Smith's retelling of the three little pigs from the wolf's point of view. It's a children's story. But anyway, I was going to say in regard to what you were saying, I don't know that we classify Beowulf as it's not a fairy tale, but it is a tale of good versus evil. And when it was first told by the Celtic bard in the oral tradition, it was a pagan tale. Once the monks got hold of it and inscribed it, it's infused with Almighty and it's infused with a Christian subtext, and it's really interesting to see how that became a vehicle for the proselytizing of Christianity.
Yeah, that's a great point, because in the oral tradition, of course, you've got all of this layering. The story has been passed on from one teller to the next, one tradition, one culture to the other. So it's great to do that kind of detective work, even though it may not be completely successful or complete. Just trying to figure out what the layers are. Yeah. Okay.
In your mention of Neil Gaiman and the importance of darkness or the dark side, it oftentimes seems to me that darkness gets a really bad rap. And certainly in some of his stories and in many stories, it's just not so clear, good and evil. And can you speak to that, where fairy tales, and certainly Disneyfication, for lack of a better term, does make a clear, almost Christian distinction, good, bad. But it seems to me, particularly the original Grimm stories, is there that it's just not so clear? Can you speak to that?
Yeah.
We'll make that the last question, too.
Oh, okay.
Thanks.
I'm associated immediately to what Neil Gaiman says about fairy tales and fantasy as escape. And he says, well, who would not want to, well, we often refer to that kind of reading as escapist, but escape, who can be against escape? Only a jailer. I think he's quoting C.S. Lewis, I think. Only a jailer can be against escape. And then he uses this wonderful metaphor of, when you escape, you go into somewhere else, another place, and you come back with an arsenal of weapons. I'm not sure, in our day and age, given the cultural climate, maybe that's not. And he also refers to a fairy tale as a loaded gun. So I've been trying to think of better metaphors, and, maybe some of you can come up with, the fireworks, but there's just this, burst of beauty and horror, which keeps us in that world. We come back with something. We come back with maybe light illumination that we can't understand the light. Somehow we can't understand the, what is it, that we can't understand the light without the darkness. But also, as Baldwin tells us in Sonny's Blues, the light is the only thing we've got in the darkness. But you have to get to know the darkness as well, otherwise you won't see the light in a way. So, thank you very much.